Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Future of Energy in Virginia. We're glad to have everybody this morning. It's right at 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. We have two wonderful speakers today I'm sure you all are eager to get to. My name is Charlie Stacy. I am the member of the Tazewell County Board of Supervisors. I drew the short straw, I guess, or Joe drew the short straw, and that I'm going to be your moderator for today's breakout session. So again, we want to welcome everybody. Our first speaker today probably doesn't need much introduction, but it's going to get an introduction anyway. Senator Tommy Norment is a speaker today. Tommy has been the minority leader of the Senate of Virginia. He served in the Virginia General Assembly since 1992. He represents the 3rd District of the Virginia Senate, which includes parts of the Virginia Peninsula, plus King and Queen County, King William County, New Kent County, and Gloucester County in the Middle Peninsula. So Senator Norment has a keen interest in electric utility operation and has served as chair of the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation. Senator Norment graduated from VMI and received his JD degree from William and Mary School of Law, which I had lunch the Friday at the cheese shop. So good. Wonderful. You're in good shape. Please help me in welcoming the senator to come share with us his thoughts on the future of energy.
Charlie, I hope you spent a lot of money in Williamsburg. We love it when guests come to town.
You all are well funded.
All right, I thought I felt an uptick in the economy, so thank you very much. Thank all of you very much for being here. I'm kind of wondering what I'm doing standing up here. You know, my good friend Bill Murray, he's kind of the technician on this. I'm sort of the BS guy on it, so I'm going to meander through some comments here on it. And I was commenting to Joe as we came in that, you know, it's a little bit of an esoteric and sometimes not the most stimulating subject that we take up, but it's very important to local governments. And speaking of local governments, let me first of all take a moment and thank you all for your public service. I rarely use the noun of politics. I prefer to think that we are all engaged in the business of public service, and sometimes it gets confused. What Charlie did not tell you that I started out my public service career as a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors, and where I think by default somehow I ended up chairman of the Board of Supervisors on it. And it was a great experience, and I really have reflected back on it with fondness for a number of reasons. I'm sure, as each of you know, that being in local government, you really are in physical proximity of the citizens that you represent. And that is what I really enjoyed, was the closeness. Secondly, I enjoyed the fact that when we made a local government decision, that I could frequently see the outcome of that decision. So those were the positive things. When I was on the Board of Supervisors in James City County, we went through a period of the most intense rezoning and residential development in the history of that area of Virginia. I grew up in Williamsburg, and I remember people coming to Williamsburg and say, gosh, what a great place it would be to live. Well, all of a sudden they started coming. And we ended up with a lot of rezoning. And so one of the downsides of being in local government, while I enjoyed the proximity of the citizens I represented, I lived 2 minutes from where the Board of Supervisors met. And when we voted on a controversial rezoning decision, by the time I got home, people were knocking on my door. So I didn't enjoy that proximity quite so much. But that was a great thing. Of course, on the state level, it's a little bit different. We're not quite as hands-on, and we focus on policy decisions that those of you in local government end up having to deal with and enact. I remember years ago, somebody in a very weak moment, and even before marijuana became legal, in a moment of hallucinogenic euphoria, they tried to get me to run for Congress. And I thought about that for about 34 seconds. And I came to the conclusion about two things. One, I didn't want to be further remote than Richmond from the people I represented. And secondly, I didn't want to be a career public servant, and I use that term very loosely for those in Congress. Let me talk to you just a little bit. I think it's important to understand some background about the evolution of electrical generation, distribution, and transmission in Virginia. So let me share with you a little bit of a history. You'll have to excuse me. I taught William & Mary Law School for 11 years, so sometimes I kind of slip back in, not as an academician, but sometimes I slip back into being a little tutorial. As you know, electricity in the Commonwealth of Virginia is a regulated monopoly, and it consists of three general areas: generation, creating the electricity, the distribution of it, getting it out, and then finally the transmission of it. And those are what are done within a service areas. Second important point, I think, is to understand who the quote players are in the electrical discussion. Because it is a regulated industry, obviously, you have the industries. Primarily, you hear about Dominion Energy, which you'll hear from Bill and some of the representatives are here. AEP, which is more in sort of the western and southwestern part of the state. And while they are investor-owned companies, then you have the co-ops, and of course, the co-ops are owned by the owners or the consumers of that electricity, are very different. Second group you have are concerned citizen groups. There are a number of very active groups. Old Dominion Committee on Fair Utilities, another group on fair utilities, and then you have the environmental groups, which you're all familiar with, which have been very active in trying to impact electrical generation in Virginia. And finally, you have the decision makers at the State Corporation Commission. And because it's a regulated monopoly, many of the issues have to go before them. It's interesting. Sometimes people say, well, gosh, how long has the SCC been around in controlling electricity? You might be surprised to hear that the predecessor of the State Corporation Commission started in 1820, and I can almost remember when they formed it that year on it. And then in 1935, they actually empowered the State Corporation Commission and its predecessors to deal with electric issues under the Federal Power Act. So that's kind of the background and the players. But how did we get to this electrical generation? You might be surprised. You might be surprised considering all of the controversy that's gone on with electrical generation and rates over the years, that it started back in the 1990s, and some major corporations in Virginia thought that there were ways to control and constrain the cost of their electricity. One of the leaders of it, frankly, was the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, now Honey & Ingalls. And they thought what they could do is that they could hold the cost of their massive electrical consumption down by doing what we call wheeling. In other words, that they could wheel or bring in from other states electrical generation that was less expensive than what it was costing in Virginia. And that was really pretty interesting, I thought. And as a result of that discussion, a commission was formed in the General Assembly dealing with utility regulation, and it sometimes was affectionately referred to as CURE. Now, whether we cured the problem or aggravated the problem is still subject to some discussion, but that's what it was. And there were some immediate tensions that developed between the industrial complex, or those large commercial users, and the individual consumers. And another issue that came up was the disparity in services and the disparity in the consuming public, that it was very different in some of the metropolitan areas as opposed to some of the rural areas where you had more co-ops and AEP's service area. Very different approaches towards things. And then the environmental groups got to be very active, the Piedmont Environmental Council, some others, and this was long before they started hibernating in trees in Western Virginia, but they got very active in that regard. But then there came something of what I would call a significant shift as a result, primarily of one Northern Virginia senator. And Bill, I guess you were around then, and a lot of people do not know this name, but an extraordinary lady by the name of Mary Margaret Whipple. And Mary Margaret Whipple was out of Northern Virginia, just a wonderful lady. And she started then what became a fairly controversial discussion about RPS, and that was renewable portfolio, renewable energy, things like hydro, solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, waste to energy, you name it. And what Mary Margaret Whipple wanted to do is she wanted to put in the law of Virginia, or codify, what the renewable portfolio would have to be. In other words, that there would be a quantification of how much renewable energy would have to enter into the marketplace through these major providers like Dominion Energy, AEP, and the co-ops. Well, it was interesting because there were already some states across the nation that were moving in this direction. Probably California and Nevada were the most advanced in doing that, and they had some escalating provisions on increasing what the renewable portfolio standards had to be each year. Fast forward from those early discussions that Mary Margaret Whipple started, right now 38 states in the District of Columbia now have statutory RPS, or renewable portfolio standards. So it's moved a long, long way. The General Assembly, in its lack of infinite wisdom, resisted that suggestion from Mary Margaret Whipple early on, but she was a very determined lady and continued to move forward and developed a coalition of advocates on it. But the conversation has continued for almost 30 years. One of the things that came about, as you all are certainly aware of, was what is known as the Virginia Clean Energy Act of 2020. And that was an interesting piece of legislation as it meandered its way through the sausage factory, sometimes known as the General Assembly of Virginia. All of you have heard about Chancellor Bismarck, and he said nobody should watch laws of sausage being made. And I've come to appreciate that in recent years as I have been there. But it really only impacted the two investor-owned generators in Virginia, which of course is Dominion and AEP. It also put in some mandatory provisions, not the least of which is by 2050. And Bill, I don't think I'm going to see this come to be a reality. I think I'll probably be over in Cedar Grove pushing up some daisies at that point. But by 2050, 100%, of renewable energy. And it's a gradual implementation, if you will. It's gradually escalated. It starts out with 6% in 2021, then in 2022, 7%, 2023, 8%, then it jumps to like 10%. But that is the percentage of renewable energy that has to be introduced into the marketplace. I think that's certainly laudable. And those of us in the General Assembly, whether we're in the majority or minority, we try to follow the law and see that it's implemented. And I'm sure that it will be, and our major generators in AEP and Dominion are certainly going to do that. But it may surprise you that there are some issues. There are some issues. There's a cost of infrastructure and sustainability. And Bill is going to chat with you a little bit about that, as Dominion has undertaken the construction of windmills 27 miles off of Virginia Beach, not too far from here. I got to thinking about this, and I am an avid bird hunter, and if any of you are sensitive to that, I'm not apologizing. It is catharsis for me if I can get out in the field and shoot some overpopulated bird. It's catharsis. You know, I can put some names on some of those birds, and it makes me feel better. Bill, your name's not on any of those pheasants, trust me, on it. But I got to thinking about it. I was in Kansas, and we were driving about 2.5 hours to a destination to go hunting. And lo and behold, out in the middle of nowhere, and I mean nowhere, was this windmill farm. And I thought, gracious be. And one of the guys that was with us was from Halliburton. And he said, Halliburton had built this windmill farm. And I said, really? I said, Dick Cheney really was that much of a visionary to be building windmill farms? You know, and that kind of captured my attention on, they were generating electricity, but yet it had to be transmitted, if you will, to where it could be distributed to the consumers. And it wasn't near anything. Then on a holiday, not long after that, my family went to Copenhagen. And the only thing I knew about Copenhagen was that one Altria or somebody created a tobacco product that was between your gum and your chin, which I only tried once because I got so ill. I was playing baseball at VMI, and you know, you had to have a mouthful of that, and that did not work so well for me. And I knew that there was a mermaid there. Imagine my surprise as the ship was pulling out of the Copenhagen harbor when I saw all of these windmills around the harbor that were generating electricity for that area of the country. And you know what? I didn't hear one person there complaining about the presence of that, because they appreciated the balance between the cost in the delivery of the service and the reliability on it. As I mentioned, of course, Dominion is moving with their windmill farm, and Bill's going to talk about that. You know, we talk about storage capacity. It's great to generate electricity. Solar, what do you do when there's no sun? You know, what do you do about windmills when there's no wind? What do you do about with electricity that you're generating? You know, if you're not prepared to consume it all at that particular point, there is a cost to that. There is a cost to that. And a lot of times you do not hear about the cost. You think about the impact of the sustainable reliability. Let me remind you, who was in Texas on February the 13th of this year? February the 13th through February the 17th, it was like a cataclysmic cloud had come over the state of Texas, where they had a sub-freezing weather front that came in, and they are still talking about it. It shut down the delivery of the electrical services that were availability. And I think it was an awakening to everybody that, hey, reliability and access is a very important thing. I remember in Virginia when we first started talking about wind energy out in the Southwest Virginia, they wanted to run a string of windmills along one of the ridge lines out there, and didn't work so well because we had to be concerned about the bats. You know, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I just never realized that bats were that valuable over, you know, the delivery of services on it. But that project didn't go. I remember we had another one that was interrupted by a very well-known species known as a snail darter. And I know all of you know about snail darters. And then recently, I live in Williamsburg. And one of the joys that I had is I lived in a residential planned community, and I used to be able to look out my sliding glass windows in our master bedroom, and I could see the glow of the nuclear plant at Surrey every night, and it was very comforting. And then I moved from that area to another subdivision down actually on the James River. And Bill, from our bedroom, I can look out and see the glow of the Surrey nuclear plant. And I want to tell you that it is comforting, but when I was on the Board of Supervisors, I represented this area known as Kings Mill, which you may have heard of. Well, soon as there was the proposal to run these lines from the Surrey nuclear plant across the James River to the delivery of electrical services for the Virginia Peninsula, man, them people in Kings Mill started ringing my doorbell off and hammering on my door. You're going to interrupt my visual delight out there with these trellises. And I'd say, damn it, think about Texas. Think about Texas. As soon as Texas happened, I have not had one complaint about those trellises, Bill, not one. On it. So there is some comfort on that, but the environmentalists, as you know, have created some issues on it. I was thinking about it from a local government standpoint and the experiences that I had in rezoning. And it dawned on me that there are some significant issues that are going to impact locally elected government officials and board of supervisors and city councils. We in the General Assembly refer to, I know that old man back here. Why are you not on a golf course today? What's wrong with you? It's too cold. We refer to the area around Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg, that Stafford as Sonova, not Nova, but Sonova, Southern Nova. And in the General Assembly last year, we had some legislation dealing with the consummate approach on NIMBYism. And we all know that's not in my backyard. By gosh, we want reliable energy. We want inexpensive energy. We want progressive energy, with some of these renewable portfolio standards. But by God, I don't want to see it, and I don't want it near me. Kings Mill all over again, on it. But it was because of these solar farms. And with another hat on, Charlie didn't tell you, I pretend to be a lawyer, not much of one, but I pretend to be one. And I work with some of our land use attorneys. We have a group that actually kind of focus on doing land use as it relates to rezoning and the development of some of these solar farms. Well, I think not everybody, but many people envisioned when the idea of solar energy came along that we'd just put 4 or 5 panels out here and it wouldn't be a problem. Well, all of a sudden, when these solar farms came along and, you've got a couple hundred or 1,000 of them, it's taking up an awful lot of property. But also there were those localities that objected to the visual intrusion. Some localities have done an excellent job of creating a screening or a buffer so that if you're driving down the highway, you really don't even know that they're there, maybe except for 300 or 400 yards off, you might see a tower or something, but you're not even aware that it's there. But then there's some other localities, one of which I represent, and it's as close as Joe to the road is to the road. And people say, oh, God, I prefer those oak trees and those pine trees, that I can see rather than those horrible looking black glasses looking at me. But by God, keep that electricity coming to my home. So we had a lot of NIMBYism. A question on how it impacts contiguous properties is something that I know from a local government. There was one done in one of the localities that I represent, and it was a fairly large one. And it was approved by the Board of Supervisors, and they installed the panels. But lo and behold, after the fact, they realized that where the panels had been installed, that there was a project that was supposed to extend a major road network that was coming through that property. And all of a sudden, here are all these solar panels, and that can increase the cost of doing business. So some land use planning certainly has to be considered because the these solar farms can certainly impact contiguous properties. There's certainly some tax implications that come of it. A lot of times, our experience has been that the solar farms are going on agricultural property, A1, A2. Some of those are in land use, meaning the tax, which you all know better than I do, that there's a reduced taxation that's put on it. And so all of a sudden it's gone from agriculture into a solar energy situation that could trigger rollback taxes from land use, but it also could impact localities and how they tax that. So and then something that's fairly recently that I think is actually pending before the State Corporation Commission, and it's called a shared solar program. And I'm certain that all of you in elected office know about this shared solar program. And it's kind of interesting. It's not where solar panels are put on the rooftops of individual homes. It's where they take a small standalone solar facility, and it may occupy just a few acres, but it has a very dedicated consumer class, and it might just be a small subdivision. How do I know about this? One of the leading pioneering projects is taking place right outside of Williamsburg in a very metropolitan area that all of you are familiar with. Is called downtown Toanna. And Toanna is about this big, but it's got a lot of undeveloped property there. And an entrepreneurial developer wants to do this shared solar program. And it's kind of interesting. From any of you around the Richmond area, there's an area not too far from downtown known as Rockets Landing. And a portion of Rockets Landing they develop them in little segments and parcels. And one of it's called the Villas at Rocket Landing. There's already this shared solar program that is existing right there, but there is a matter pending before the State Corporation Commission as we talk. And why is it before the State Corporation Commission? Well, one, they regulate electrical generation, et cetera, in Virginia. But secondly, there's a really thorny issue about the cost. And what they do is they say you have a little subdivision who wants to do this shared solar energy, and you would pay a monthly fee for that source of energy, but embedded within the cost recovery structure of Dominion and AEP and even some co-ops is, hey, we're recovering the capital cost of investment, and all of a sudden you're going to be taking consumers off of that, contributing to the repayment of that capital cost. And is it a significant variance that the discussion is going on? And maybe the Dominion people know better than I do, but the last that I've heard is that the developer thought the monthly cost for the consumers in that little subdivision should be $6.58 a month. On the other hand, there are those in the industry that say it should be $74.28 a month. I was an English history major at VMI because I could never pass a math course, but I can see that's a pretty good delta there between, $7, and $75. So we'll see how that comes out. There's another issue that we have to deal with that we as a Commonwealth and I think as a country have been perplexed by, and that's what I would call fluctuating energy costs and the implications of it. I am so old that I remember from 1969 to 1976, there was this thing called an oil embargo. And some of you in the room may remember the oil embargo. And what did that do? It totally destabilized prices, totally. I can remember, the great gas situation. One of my roommates and I from Virginia were going to go see our other roommate who lived up in New Jersey, which I never could understand why he lived in New Jersey. but he did. And we had to get our motorboat gas tanks and fill them up because we weren't sure we were going to be able to get any gas as we were coming down the interstate on it. And my roommate was driving and he was so concerned about gas consumption, he wouldn't even cut on the heat, and it was snowing. I said, oh. Anyway, but how about the oil embargo? Nuclear, are the energies with nuclear? Surrey is a wonderful neighbor, and I mean that sincerely, a wonderful neighbor, employs lots of people from our area, a reliable, consistent delivery on it. But people in the back of their minds, they think about Renewable, and it creates a flashpoint and a concern. And some of you may have forgot Fukushima over in Japan also had a situation. It had another significant impact as we have dealt with renewable portfolio standards and the generation of energy. And if any of my friends in here from Southwest Virginia have a hard time remembering, let me tell you, there was a time where the industry in Southwest Virginia was highly dependent upon the mining of coal. And if you can get back, as you're leaving here and going home, and if you go through the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, which was a delight this morning. Oh God, I just love it. On it, but we're working on it. We have what we call HR TAC, and in my neck of the woods, I'm digressing, and we'll shut up in 1 second, Charlie. I was thinking, I worked with Governor Warner in a group, and we passed some transportation taxes on it, and part of the transportation tax is captured in Hampton Roads, and we're using that money it's part of the gas tax, about 10 cents, and we're using that money to widen 64. Some of you may have come down 64 from Richmond and you see a stretch of it where it's 3 lanes and then a stretch where it's 2 lanes. It's because those guys in Richmond they're in a different transportation district and they won't put the money in the pot to put 3 lanes on. But those of us in Hampton Roads who are very fiscally responsible and we are concerned about the citizens we represent, we broaden it to 3 lanes with that money, but we're also building the third crossing that you will see. As you go back across, you look to your left, you'll see the infrastructure that's going in on that. But on the coal situation, if you don't think it's still important, when you come out of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, look to your left at Newport News Shipbuilding, and you will see piles of coal where they used to come in on the Surrey pipeline, but it's had significant fiscal implications. And those of you from Southwest Virginia know what that's all about. Gas, Lord have mercy. Bill, you're going to talk about gas and windmills? Well, I won't steal his thunder, but I will say this. I bet. Anybody in here old enough to remember this guy? Johnny Carson, the great Carnac? Johnny Carson, the great Carnac. If I were the great Carnac, I would say Bill is going to talk to you about the fluctuation in gas prices and why that's important on the delivery of renewable energy, like wind. Another thing that we have dealt with in an effort to try to stimulate some of the development of alternative forms or renewable form of energies under the Clean Air Act, under Virginia's 2020 Act is what we call RECS, and that's what we call renewable energy certificates. And basically, it's like a commodity that you can buy, that industries can buy to help offset the cost of doing some of these things. So there's a lot of issues out there. And as I said, it sounds a little esoteric, but it's the real deal. It is very, very serious. And Virginia has embarked in 2020 legislation to move on renewable energies. And as I said, it is set up on an escalating percentage every year. But while it is a laudable approach to using renewable energies and preserving trees, I read the other day where 1 acre of trees in the course of a year can provide and generate enough oxygen for 18 people. And so when you look at it in the context of really, is there a benefit in preserving some areas of the environment and not clear cutting? Yeah, there is, but there's always a cost of doing business. So I think one of the challenges that the General Assembly has had in the last 2 years, and this is not a political statement, so don't anybody get all fired up. Just my observation from standing back is that there has been an anxiety to do what we want to do and do it now, an impatience. And those of you in local government know sometimes when you move in haste, you don't necessarily look long range at what the long-term implications are fiscally, from society, from your community. And the General Assembly's done a little bit of that in the last 2 years. And I think you're going to see some revisiting from trying to quantify what some of the financial implications are, because they're going to affect your localities. They're going to affect your localities. And while there has been the laudable push towards renewable energy, there are significant costs associated with it. There are significant land use issues that are associated with it. And there are significant societal issues that are against it. And you still have the tension. I'm a guy who believes that tension in government is a good thing. I really do. I'm about to probably get assassinated by my Republican friends, but this is just a tenet of government, I believe. I'm not persuaded that government on a federal level or on a state level works best where you have the executive branch and both bodies in the legislative branch of the same party. And that's Republicans or Democrats. And I have been through both. And the reason is that you can have a total be dismissive of the minority and do what you want. I happen to believe that tension in government is a good thing. The conflict is good because it forces you to think and get to a compromise. And compromises are generally better than a unilateral imposition of policies. And I'm just saying there are a lot of tensions that are there within these renewable energies. And I think we've got to continue, we collectively as citizens, we as state government, local government need to continue to monitor that situation very carefully to be sure, one, that we're reaching the goals, that the goals are identifiable and reasonable, and that the citizens of the Commonwealth of Virginia can afford it. So with that, I appreciate you listening to my meanderings. I'm not very intellectually disciplined and I kind of extemporaneous, but thank you very much for listening to me. And you're going to get a real treat now because Bill Murray knows what he's talking about. I don't.
Questions for both of our panelists today. So we'll go ahead and let Mr. Murray come on and give his remarks, and then we've saved enough time, hopefully, to be able to do that. So our next speaker is Bill Murray, a Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Communications for Dominion Energy. He's responsible for federal, state, and local government relations, so he is probably a familiar face for many of us. He is also involved with corporate communications, advertising, public relations, creative service, philanthropy, and community affairs. Prior to joining Dominion in 2007, he served as the management analyst at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, a senior staff member for the Virginia General Assembly, and vice president policy at Virginia Hospital Association. He also held several positions in the offices of former governors Mark Warner and Tim Kaine. Bill received his bachelor's degree from history in the University of Virginia, his master's degree in public administration from Virginia Tech, and his doctorate in public administration and public policy from Virginia Tech. So help me give a warm welcome to Bill Murray. Bill, thank you.
With that introduction, I'm embarrassed to admit I still rooted for Notre Dame on Saturday night. So, most important two positions in the Catholic Church, Pope and quarterback at Notre Dame, not in that order necessarily. Let me start with a Surrey story, since the senator reminded me of this. 1972. So, way back in the early 70s, federal government had been on a period of time for, almost a decade of getting utilities to switch from coal to oil generation. And when you hear today about you got to do X, Y, or Z with the electric grid to reduce dependence on foreign oil, that's wrong. We use very little oil these days. The exception to that might be New England. in very cold weather. New England still burns a fair amount of fuel oil, but nationally, oil is a very small source of electric generation. In the 70s is a very significant source. And oil had been cheap for a long time, looked like it would be cheap forever. So the company that then the Virginia Electric and Power Company, as Dominion was known in those days, that's still the legal name of the Virginia utility, was working on 2 nuclear units at Surrey Power Station, which the senator referenced. And we were taking some criticism because the thought was it would be so much easier to just do oil. Oil's been cheap for a long time. It'll be cheap forever. So we did persevere. Surrey 1 began commercial operations in late 1972. Surrey 2 began commercial operations in the spring of 1973. So by the fall of 1973, both units were operating around the clock as they continue to do today. And in fact, we've just gotten the license for Surrey renewed so that it can run for 80 years. So in that case, that means Surrey 1 can run through 2052, if I'm doing the math correctly. So that fall, you had the Yom Kippur War, sometimes known as the October War. Israel got caught totally off guard. President Nixon, whatever your views are, President Nixon stripped our frontline divisions bare in Germany to resupply Israel. So Israel went from an existential crisis, almost being wiped off the map, to holding its own, and was probably had the upper hand. Probably did have the upper hand when the Soviet Union and the U.S. decided, okay, that's been enough, and sort of pressured both sides to call it truce. That then led to the first oil shock, as Daniel Yergin calls it, or as some of us remember, the Arab Oil Embargo. And as the senator accurately described, remember, in those days, I was living in Newport News as a young child. My father had a job in Richmond, and he used to have to beg to get gas. He had one of those old gas guzzlers because the governor at the time, Governor Godwin, had gone to odd and even license plates. If you had license plates that ended with an odd number, you could buy gas on certain days, even number of other days. So it is baked in our corporate DNA, suddenly having nearly 2,000 megawatts, megawatt enough energy for 250 homes. So if you think of Surrey, it's almost enough energy to serve 500,000 homes around the clock. It looked pretty smart to have something that wasn't oil. So it's baked in our corporate DNA that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. Now, it may shock you to learn from looking at me and my nerdy glasses. I'm kind of a sci-fi nerd. And in fact, my wife told me the other day, well, I guess you start planning your retirement now. The original Star Trek's on Netflix, so that's all you're going to need. Much as I love Lord of the Rings, I'm repeating myself from yesterday's panel, so I apologize. So I just got to hear this twice. There's a little tendency in energy policy to go for the one ring to rule them all. I call that the Lord of the Rings theory of energy. Just do this, this, or this, and that'll solve all your problems and just have this one energy resource. We have never been for that. We've always believed in a diverse portfolio, a diverse range of approaches. So with that introduction, I thought we'd talk about just a couple ways that at the utility we can work with local governments, and then I'll shut up and the senator I can answer some questions jointly. First is on reliability. And reliability, safety crowds out everything else. So let's talk briefly about safety first, as we should. Sometimes people ask, what is your first priority in restoring power when there's been a power outage? Is it hospitals? Is it water treatment facilities? Actually down wires. The very first thing you do, always safety first. It's first thing in any meeting, you always do safety. And when I talk a little bit about our undergrounding program, one of the reasons that program works so well in terms of reducing the length of outages is it reduces the number of down wires. So always we do safety first. Right after safety comes reliability. And if I may sort of plagiarize President Kennedy a little bit, that is an area where we will pay any price and bear any burden to keep the lights on. The senator described this Griff's Creek power line. I formed actually some pen-pal relationships using pal maybe with air quotes during that time with any number of folks who lived in Kings Mill. And as the senator also accurately describes, post-Texas, probably hearing less about that these days. I think it's also a case where once the line was built and you could actually look at it, it maybe didn't look as menacing as maybe some of the folks who were working on the other side of that issue. But in any event, reliability can be very prosaic, trimming trees. That's a key strategy, reliability. It can be very high-tech, intelligent devices, a self-healing grid. It can involve power generation. Nuclear power, certainly the backbone of our reliability for a long time, since 1972. 2 nuclear units at Surrey, as I've already mentioned, and then 2 at North Anna, which is in Louisa County. It can also take the form of new approaches to things. Now, who knew, okay, I'm going to repeat myself for the second time here. Who had heard the term derecho prior to the super derecho of about 10 years ago? Who'd heard that term? If you did, you were a really good meteorology student. I had not heard the term. It was a Friday night. My then teenage daughter woke me up and said, Dad, get up. You're going to have some power outages. So this was about midnight on the Friday before July 4th. And it was 100-some degrees that whole weekend. And I got up, I looked at my state-of-the-art BlackBerry, and I looked on our system to see how many outages we had. And I think I was probably expecting to see 20, 30,000 outages. I saw 1.2 million outages. So I called our then head of Corp Comm, Chet, and said, wow, Chet, that's a lot of outages. What's going on? He said, it's something called a derecho. So I then went to Google to figure out what a derecho was. In any event, we had the shortest meeting in Dominion history, presided over by our CEO, Tom Farrell at the time, God rest his soul. We had a lot of executives out of town for the holiday weekend, not surprisingly. Unlike a hurricane, we didn't expect any significant weather. Tom ran the meeting in 30 seconds. Rodney's in charge. Rodney was our head of distribution at the time. Everyone else, give him what he needs, do whatever it takes to get the lights back on, keep me informed. 30 seconds. We will bear it, any burden, pay any price for reliability. Out of that ratio grew a new program we call Strategic Underground. For a long time, we had a Q&A after there'd be a big power outage. Why don't you put all the lines underground? That was the question. The answer is, well, it would be too expensive. Putting all the lines underground would cost X number of $1 billion. We can't do it. From the derecho, the aha moment for Mr. Blevins and others, but Rodney's really the father of this program was, you know, it's not all or nothing. What if we put the worst performing lines underground? Let's look for the best bang for the buck. So we spent a couple years doing some engineering and found that if you put the 20% of our worst performing lines underground, you could reduce the, and by tap lines, small neighborhood lines, not talking big power lines here, it's small neighborhood distribution lines. You put the worst performing lines underground, you can reduce the length of a major outage by half. Good bang for the buck. And that's a program that we continue to work on today. Now, all of you are local officials. Now, from our standpoint, reliability is very good, but not good enough, because until it's perfect, it's not good enough. And I realize that's a North Star, and that seems fanciful to talk about perfect reliability, but that's the expectation. And anytime we're not doing good enough, we want to talk to you about how to make it better. And so first area to work together is on reliability. And that can take any number of forms. As I said, it could be tree trimming. It could be some high-tech improvements to the grid. It could be looking at the strategic undergrounding program where that might make sense in neighborhoods there. But it's something that we always start the business with. Secondly, though, we also look at cost. And now, don't get me wrong, if it takes, in the midst of a situation like Texas, if we have to pay an exorbitant rate to buy natural gas on the market to keep the lights on, we'll do it. Because again, we'll pay any price, bear any burden to keep the lights on. We don't like doing that. And as the senator alluded to, renewables, they definitely have some fixed costs. What they don't have are variable costs, that is to say fuel costs. And here again, there's no one solution. You absolutely need traditional energy. Nuclear remains and has been, as I said, for 50 years, the backbone of our power generation. You tell a lot of people at Dominion we're in the Navy because we call it a generation fleet. But, you know, certainly the backbone of our fleet. What's nice about a large renewable resource like offshore wind is there are no fuel costs. And we are in a period of rising natural gas prices. We went for more than a decade where natural gas prices stayed very, very low, historic lows. And kind of like the very low prices of oil back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when things have stayed low for a long time, there is a tendency to think it will last forever. For example, who among you have remembers reading an article 4 or 5 years ago, have we tamed inflation forever? Anybody remember reading an article like that? Okay. So no, we haven't. Inflation's back. If you talk to people today in focus groups or other types of consumer research, you'll hear a lot about the price of bacon or eggs or whatever it might be. So this winter, it won't be electricity prices going up. Electric utilities, or at least our utility, doesn't reset its fuel costs until the spring, wouldn't take effect till next summer. Home oil, heating oil companies, natural gas companies, they do adjust their price more frequently. Commodity prices are up a lot for both oil and natural gas. So that's something to be aware of this winter. I mentioned that while we do have 3.5 million natural gas customers nationally, we don't have any in Virginia. We're not a natural gas utility. We do have a company-funded energy share program. Absolutely, customers contribute to that program, but it's primarily company-funded, not customer-funded. Any customer contributions are voluntary. There's no regulated sort of customer contributions to it. But that program doesn't just pay for low-income customers with electricity. We also do natural gas. We bought firewood. We do propane. So I mentioned our energy share program. We work with the United Way, Salvation Army, and other nonprofit partners in our service territory. So I call that to your attention because this is going to be a challenging winter for heating costs. Again, not because electricity prices are going up this winter, but the way the commodity costs have gone up for heating oil, natural gas. I've not checked propane, but I'm going to go ahead and assume if natural gas and oil are up, pretty safe bet propane's up. So reliability is one way to work together. Cost is another way to work together. By the way, it turns out that decision on Surrey Power Station all those years ago was a great bet for customers in terms of cost, because we've had very reliable costs per kilowatt hour for those many decades. We were pleased. We recently received the relicensure of Surrey to run at 80 years, working on that same thing for North Anna. So we're going to have our nuclear units in Virginia for a long time to come. Land use. Senator alluded to this with solar. Solar energy is actually very cost effective right now. It is intermittent. Senator's absolutely right. Works about a quarter of the time, but very cost effective. When it's operating, it is land intensive. And how land intensive is it? Well, 1 megawatt, again, 250 homes, 1 megawatt, about 10 acres of land. So an opportunity to work together. It would not be a good policy to say, well, let's take all the prime land in the Commonwealth that could be used for farming, the absolute best farmland, and let's put solar on it. What is a better land use is to say, what is a site that was very workable for solar, but maybe doesn't have as many alternative uses? And I'm going to use this as just an example. In Southwest Virginia, back in September, we announced a partnership with the Nature Conservancy where we're going to be siting large-scale solar on abandoned mine sites. Now, those are not infinite. That's not a single solution, but looking at industrial reuse or other better land uses where the land maybe doesn't have as many options as prime farmland would or wooded acres or what have you. That's an opportunity for us to work together on finding the best land use solution. Now, for 100 and some years, we've worked with our local government partners on land use in Virginia, but it's been more discrete things like siting a substation. A couple acres here, a couple acres there. This much larger scale undertaking, and it's something we want to work with you very closely on. I've heard talk from time to time of those in the solar industry say, well, we ought to change local government authority around land use. That's not something we're interested in or asking for. We like the current arrangement with local land use. We like working with our local government partners. And what we want to do for any project we do is have the local government feel that we've sited at a place that makes the most sense for the community. And then finally, an area we can work together, I'm going to call universal access. First of all, we're a utility. That means an obligation to serve. So if you have a new home or business come to the community, we've got an obligation to serve them with electric service promptly, safely, and efficiently, and we're going to do that. We've also gotten into some other areas where there was an opportunity to play the role of universal service. Mid-mile broadband. We're absolutely not an internet service provider. We're not going to be an internet service provider. I want to be clear on that. But as we do upgrade our own substations, we're laying right much broadband fiber. And a couple of years ago, it occurred to the General Assembly we might have a role in solving what's called the mid-mile problem. And that is getting fiber in the community where you could hand it off to an internet service provider. Sometimes that's a cable company like All Points Broadband, and sometimes it's an electric cooperative. And what we're finding is that's been very cost effective. If we're laying fiber anyway for our own reliability purposes, it doesn't take a lot more to also get sort of ready for a broadband provider to serve a rural community. And it's a program that we've had good partnerships with local governments, and I'll call that to your attention. As we think about EV charging, it's also occurred to us we've got an opportunity there for universal access. We have no need or interest in being the fifth provider at Tyson's Corner or at Short Pump, or in the case of the senator's area, maybe Newtown, where my daughter used to have an apartment. That seems like the kind of place that EV charging is going to take care of itself. We don't need a role, but we might want to be the only provider somewhere that wouldn't otherwise have access. So these are a couple ways we can work together: reliability, cost, land use, and then universal access. And with that, I'm going to shut up, and then maybe the two of us could jointly answer some questions. So thank you.
So I guess we can open up the questions. I've got a couple of staff prepared questions, but I don't know that we're going to need those. So questions for either of our speakers, please feel free to raise your hand. I think we're small enough room that if you'll stand up, just identify yourself. I think everybody should be able to hear okay.
Also great because one of the definitions I've always had is the difference in the voice of politicians. One of my concerns being more rural area, you know, the opportunity for government. I'm concerned about this. I would like to see what it is. Grants coming down.
Okay, well, you certainly threw a lot of opportunities out there. And first of all, you used that dreaded term of politicians. I know you're a public servant. I can tell by your delivery of remarks. On that, I am aware that there have been some localities that have enacted a moratorium, and that is probably annoying to some individuals that would like to move faster. I hope that those localities that have enacted a moratorium are doing so with the expectation of moving deliberately so that they can look at it thoroughly, perhaps even have the opportunity to look at other localities that have already implemented and allowed some of the renewable energy sources and to see really what the impact of solar energy and the solar farms are. So a lot will depend upon the personality and the disposition of the locality. So I am aware of that. I'm not aware on a state level, have we done any grants?
Not that I'm.
So I was going to say, I'm, you know, in my old age, I can't remember things like I used to. I told people I was there in Jamestown in 1619 when they had the first legislative assembly. So I forget things, but I am not aware that we have enacted any kind of grant programs focused particularly for the agricultural community, whether you know it's chicken farms, you know, whether it's hog farms, cattle raising, or even crop raising. I'm not aware that we have done that, but I'm certainly sensitive to what you're saying, and maybe we need to find the legislature. In fact, I'm looking at my good friend Senator Mason there. He is very sensitive to agricultural situations, and so but you need to find an advocate, and there are those that are hallucinogenic statement. We are flush with cash and we have all this money and we can just spend it anywhere. But as always, there's competition for the priorities of money. So I'm not aware it's happened up to this point, but it doesn't mean it cannot be a consideration.
And I'll pick it up from there. What we do have is I think about that has less to do with grants and more to do. Net metering is where you sort of buy retail, sell retail, you get full retail they generate, and that's restricted to energy sort of for your own use. What that agricultural net metering program is a little plus with clients recognizing that often farmers some parcels that are contiguous but might be served by multiple meters. So I do mention that section, the idea that it was exactly relatively small scale setting. I will note that the current president of the wrote about a tobacco farm in Whipple County. So our leadership is very agriculturally aware of one priority we have is working with the farmer and others to identify what is this. It's the absolute choice agricultural land. Stay on the highest and best use of choice agriculture, not necessarily energy generation. We don't need a choice soil in order to soil. It's not more together. On the federal infrastructure bill, this is something I'll defer to my colleagues in Washington. I will say that we'll digest that. We're going to be particularly interested. Sometimes Congress works in a broad brush. We want to see the agency sort of guidance from the Department of Energy and others of, okay, Congress gave us this direction. Here's how you apply for a grant. That's kind of what we're looking at. And then on the underground, the short answer is yes, we do have a plan for that. It's kind of a rolling plan, and what we do is do the math. So we look at of the circuits that we have, over 10%. Looking back on the past decade, in terms of number of unscheduled outages. Once in a while, we schedule an outage for our own maintenance purposes, and we'll typically do it during the day, so that the normal times, but so we look where there have been the most outages, and that's where we it's an algorithm telling us when if something very happens down with any local official.
So let me ask one question real quick. Have you ever been in church on Sunday and the preacher starts his sermon and then all of a sudden feel that little sting in your life? You're like, it just really comes home to you? Well, being from Tazewell County, we had this ridgeline issue with wind turbines about 10 years ago, where we rose up in opposition to what we thought was a travesty of justice. So Senator the Preacher found me in the audience today, but the question that I have, and it applies probably maybe more so to those of us representing rural areas, is our people, in a sense, were educated years ago that climate change is not real and sustainable energy is designed to eliminate our primary industry of coal. And we've never gone back to re-educate the people. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives, one from the legislative standpoint and the other from the industry, is do we need to go back and revisit our messaging on climate change itself and the need for renewable energies to be a part of the portfolio? Because I think a lot of the NIMBY arguments that we get are predicated off of an educated belief at the time that this was just a waste. This was just something that was being forced upon the communities, and nobody wanted to see destruction done to aesthetic areas of their community just for the sake of being able to claim a renewable portfolio. So I'm curious for both of you what your thoughts would be on whether we need to re-educate in any way, shape, or form the people from messages that were previously given.
Well, first of all, it wasn't coincidental that I mentioned Tazewell. I just mentioned the project. And I recall it's the first time I've ever had anything in common with the minister. Just a sidestep. I remember when I was first elected to the Senate, nobody thought that I would win. So we only had one phone line coming into where our reception was. And some of the media couldn't get a hold of me, so they called my mother. And they said, well, we understand that Tommy's a very religious man. I had been a Southern Baptist till I got married and saw the error of my ways and became an Episcopalian. So my mother said, oh, Tommy's a very nice young man. And said, he used to be religious, but now he's an Episcopalian. On it, but the situation, I think there is an enormous misunderstanding about renewable energy, where it fits into the climate issues that we're having. You know that the international community just had here a little over a week ago to discuss some of these climate issues. It was interesting to me that they got concurrence and buy-in from many of the major countries that exist, except for China and Russia. When you look at not just the population, but the land mass and the demands for energy, that's a little disturbing. But I think there is an enormous lack of understanding, and I embrace part of that. So I'm speaking to myself as well. An enormous misunderstanding, a lack of understanding about climate control, what the demands are on energy. Of course, a whole plethora of other issues that are associated with climate control. But I mean, not too very far from here. You know, I mentioned, as did Bill, about the wind farm 27 miles off Virginia Beach. Well, by the time they build it, it may be 28 miles off of Virginia Beach because of the resiliency issue and the flooding issues that are very much of a concern of Virginia Beach. And in the last election cycle, Virginia Beach passed a referendum to impose a tax to deal with that issue. So it's unfortunate when it takes something as significant as a threat to your community that is attributable to a change in climate control, that all of a sudden you're going to lose the beachfront at Virginia Beach, which is, of course, their revenue generator. And we as citizens are so concerned that we're going to impose a tax on ourselves to try to deal with that. To me, that's a true awakening. That is an epiphany. But there are other parts of Virginia that don't feel that immediacy. And I think there needs to be an ongoing education program. It's just according to St. Thomas.
And I'll just add, when you look at electricity costs, typically natural gas is kind of your default that you measure against. You look at whatever you're doing compared to natural gas prices. For a long time, solar has been absolutely, the downside of solar is very land intensive. We'll talk about that. It's been cost competitive for a good number of years now. Offshore wind, as part of the filing we just did, we had to calculate over the life of the project. Is it ratepayer positive, customer positive, ratepayer positive, or negative? We found, yes, it's positive. When you look at fuel savings, the tax credits we expect, and as the senator mentioned, it's 27 miles offshore. So certainly, you don't get the viewshed issues you would with something that's much closer to shore. We have the blessing of continental shelf off Virginia Beach, so you can go 27 miles offshore. The water's still not very deep. That's something not every state has that advantage. I've been a little negligent not to mention economic development as an area we can work together for purely self-interested motives. You might imagine we're for every form of business, every form of legal business in the Commonwealth because they all plug in. They all plug into the grid. So we've had a long-standing cooperative approach with both state and local government on economic development. We were very pleased at the beginning of this month to announce the Port Blade factory in the U.S., facility in the U.S. at the Portsmouth Marine Terminal with our partners at Siemens for Renewable Energy. We do see offshore wind in particular having a tremendous supply chain opportunity for the U.S. And bluntly, solar panels are small enough you can ship them overseas. Offshore wind components are so massive, you really need the supply chain here. It's very difficult long term to bring, components of that magnitude, from overseas. Certainly, offshore wind also offers a lot of exciting economic development prospects, and that's something we're working on.
Next question. Would come up to a microphone. Some of the surrounding rooms are giving us some competing sound. If you could just come up.
I'm the one you asked to come up to a speaker. I am Peggy Kaiser, Dickinson County Representative from Southwest Virginia. I don't really have a question. I just want to thank Mr. Murray for Dominion Energy selecting the property in Dickinson County and Wise County to help our county and jobs and to move forward. I just want to thank Dominion Energy for selecting that
Thank you for
area.
Such a great business climate in the culture.
Right.
First project I worked on at Dominion was Virginia City Hybrid Energy
Right.
Center. And I always enjoyed the great business climate.
Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead. Can you step up to the mic just a little bit? It's a little hard to hear.
My name is Luke Yellow. Concerned about it. The number one question is the panel itself. 25 to 30 years behind recycled wire, frame. Nobody will give us an answer. What do you spend? Is it recycled? Hazard. If we have a storm, panels back, rain, the water that runs out of the stream, I'd like to know your
In terms of back end,
the last thing. And I've got one answer. This is sunlight. It is. If you've ever been in an airplane, you get one just right, it still reflects the sunlight back to the other side. Fix it. Just go for the property.
I'll take them in reverse order. As far as the ozone issue, I'm probably not the right technical expert to answer it. The general literature is that solar energy, carbon free, so it's from the standpoint of air quality and carbon control generally, that it's a net positive. I'll get you more specific answer. That's an issue I'm not familiar with, but certainly happy to research that. On the decommissioning, so I'm gonna quote one of your fellow local officials, and yeah, maybe here as well. The advantage of, I suppose, the utilities, we're going to be in 25 or 30 years. Every solar project is going to have a decommissioning provision. Sometimes it's a performance bond you post. Sometimes I think we would typically prefer to guarantee it with our own balance sheet, but that's the applicant, whether it's us or an independent solar developer, that's our responsibility on the back end to safely decommission the project. I could see scenarios where we might say, okay, we want to treat it like a traditional power plant where we'll keep upgrading it over time if it's working for the community, and we want to extend the life, and that would involve swapping our panels, whatever it might be. Or if I can quote a former governor of ours from this region, Governor Valley used to like to say, you like to put the campsite back better than and that's certainly incumbent on us to do. We'll offer financial guarantees at the front end. That's our responsibility. I would say all forms of energy generate waste products. You got to deal with one up. Nuclear, I mentioned, and hopefully that's sufficiently solved my enthusiasm for nuclear power. But we've certainly had nuclear waste storage issues. Coal has been a very valuable energy resource. But some years ago, I became Dominion spokesperson, Senator on coal ash because I didn't go to a meeting and I got assigned it by not being at the meeting. Here we are, 15 years later, still have that issue. So that's something that we're used to dealing with. While we're certainly
don't plan to be perfect. We've had a strong record of environmental stewardship. I fully expect to continue that with salt. But the short answer is it's the applicant's responsibility in 25 or 30 years to safely decommission, whether that's through recycling, disposing of in an appropriate landfill, or reusing the materials, or rehabbing the site, whatever makes sense for the particular site and for local governments.
I would say from the General Assembly standpoint, I don't recall a lot of discussion looking that far out. And as I mentioned earlier, haste to do things, but we've certainly had more than an adequate period of time to reflect on it. I don't recall a whole lot of discussion about decommissioning and the ancillary related issues that may be associated with it. So that may be something we need to take a look towards.
All right, thank you. We have about 15 minutes for your next breakout session, so that'll be a good time for us to wind up here. Please help me in giving a round of applause to our presenting speakers today.